Good afternoon to one and all present here. Today, we're all gathered here on this virtual platform for the third session of the 16th two-day National Workshop on Research Methodology put forward by the Kerala Law Academy Law College Trivandrum in association with Center for Advanced Legal Studies and Research. I proudly welcome each one of you to this event. I now invite Ms. Shruti, student of First Sem LLM, to officially welcome the guest of the session. Shruti, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we are all gathered here virtually as part of the 16th two-day National Workshop on Research Methodology conducted by Kerala Law Academy Law College Trivandrum in association with Center for Advanced Legal Studies and Research. I'm profoundly delighted to welcome our chief speaker for the session, Professor Dr. Sandeepa Bhat, Professor of Law and Director of Center for Aviation and Space Law, NUJS, Kolkata. Dr. Sandeepa Bhat joined NUJS in 2007 and currently he is working as a professor of law. He has more than 15 years of teaching and research experience at NLSIU Bangalore and NUJS Kolkata. He did his LLB from Bangalore University with third rank and received the gold medal for top scoring the college. He has done his specialization in international law and business and trade law with first rank and double gold medals at University of Mysore. His PhD is in the field of space law. He has presented more than 50 research papers in the international and national conferences, including the conferences held at Jakarta, Seoul, Sharjah, and Singapore. In addition, he has the distinction of being the member of ISRO Expert Advisory Group for drafting the National Space Act for India. So, without consuming any time, I would like to call upon Professor Dr. Sandeepa Bhat, sir, to deliver his speech on the topic, how to develop a research proposal in this session, and to enlighten us with his words of true wisdom. Your comments will be quintessential for the students who aspire to become like you one day. We would be delighted with your expertise and knowledge in every way possible. Sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And very good afternoon to all of you. Let me just actually share the screen. I have some slides, so hope that works. Is it working? Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay, so before I start, let me thank as well as congratulate the Kerala Law Academy for having this wonderful workshop with respect to the research. Of course, having actually the workshop or maybe the conferences on the research is a kind of a rarity which we see, and full-fledged 2 days workshop on this, I think it's really a welcome step, and I should congratulate the Kerala Law Academy for having such kind of a wonderful workshop. Now, before I proceed, let me just actually start with the caveat. And what I'm going to discuss or what I'm going to present now is not something which you can find in any book or maybe actually in any kind of a standard format. It is more of actually my own experience. Of course, the format of the research proposal may be something which you can find it as common. But what I'm going to tell is more of my own experience in the last 2 decades or so. So if you have any difference of opinion, definitely no problem. You're welcome to actually discuss with me towards the end of today's presentation. Yeah, so let me just actually discuss about my own experience with respect to how to develop a research proposal. I remember that my teacher, my maybe mentor as well as guru, Professor H.K. Nagaraj and Professor Ishwar Bhat, both of them from University of Mysore, both of them telling me that if you have developed a very systematic research proposal, your work is half done. Almost half of your entire research work is done if you develop a systematic research proposal. I was not very sure when actually they were telling about that, because our understanding was that, okay, a proposal is just an initial stage in terms of doing the research. So how can we say that it's a half-done work? Already actually half of the entire research would be done with a simple research proposal. But today I can definitely say that what they have said is absolutely right. If you do a systematic proposal, definitely your research work is half done, and remaining is just to fill in the gaps and to come up with a proper report for the purpose of the evaluation. So in this direction, what are the essential things which a researcher has to do? This may be for actually a PhD thesis, or maybe for an LLM dissertation, or even actually a research project, a sponsored research project for whatever thing a proposal is supposed to be drafted. There are certain key things which need to be done by the researcher. Let me start with the preliminary research. It is an impossible task just to develop a proposal overnight or maybe in a couple of days. One need to do an extensive preliminary research. Most of the time, I have seen people saying that, oh, I am very fascinated towards a space law. I would like to do some research on space law. Like, of course, I'm fascinated towards it. That's a different issue. But anyhow, when they tell me that I'm really fascinated, I would like to work on militarization, I would like to work on space debris, whatever other aspect it may be, I have found that they have not done preliminary research. Rather, they found that it is something very catchy, and they found that there is a lot of actually developments happening in this particular field. Presuming that there is a scope in the future, they would jump into the topic. That is not the way of selecting a research topic. Because all this fascination would go, right? So of course, initially everyone would be over enthusiastic to work on that particular topic, which catches their mind. But PhD research, or maybe a research project, would be for a period of 3 to 4 years minimum. Of course, some people might take more than that. There is no doubt in terms of it. But this 3 to 4 years extensive research cannot be done simply on the basis of a fascination towards a particular topic. Something is catchy, I'm going to write 200 pages on that. That doesn't work. At the end of the day, some might end up in writing an article of 10 to 15 pages, not more than that. That might be a problem. So that's why, unless and until you do a preliminary research, you should not actually jump into take a particular research area or a topic. I always tell this to my students that you do the preliminary research in the area, whatever actually you're going to take up. And then this kind of a preliminary research on different, actually the existing literature would definitely lead for a kind of a reflective thinking. Because when somebody actually goes through different existing literature, they will start thinking, okay, so what are the gaps in the existing norms? What kind of actually the problems might arise in the area which actually they are looking into? All these kind of actually developments would start only after preliminary research. This helps a lot, even in terms of identifying the problems. What are the core areas which are going to be looked into? What are the major problems existing in a particular research area? That can be identified only with the help of reading already existing literature. So therefore, your preliminary research should definitely help you in terms of finding out the problems, maybe plethora of problems, or whatever actually you'll be able to identify in the field of your research. Then, preliminary research also helps you to ensure the adequacy of data for the research. As I told you just before, if you take a topic of fascination without the preliminary research, you might end up writing an article. You might not be able to actually have sufficient resources for the purpose of writing maybe a thesis of 200 pages. Of course, I'm not quantitatively assessing your PhD thesis or maybe dissertation. I'm not telling that. But still, none of us are Hugo Grotius. We can't say that actually 25 pages work would award a PhD for us. Right? It's true that Hugo Grotius, the so-called father of international law, had a 25 pages thesis, which was awarded PhD. And we have some Nobel laureates whose 10-page theses and all have also been awarded PhD. That's a different thing. That's a different thing. No, we can't say that actually it's a general norm and we can write a 25 pages fantastic thesis and get a PhD. That doesn't happen. So therefore, one need to ensure that there is adequate data available for the purpose of doing an extensive research and also in terms of report writing. Of course, I'm not telling about the 400, 500 pages thesis. There were days wherein actually people used to write a long thesis, right? Especially in law, in the field of law, thesis used to be quite long. But nowadays, we don't have such a kind of a system. Short thesis has become a kind of a mandate, but still, we can't think of less than maybe 200 pages. So that is what is the current standard with respect to a thesis. Finally, your preliminary research would also help in terms of preventing the duplication of the work. If we know what are the works which are already being done in the particular area which we are going to select, we would be able to prevent duplication of already existing work. Because research is primarily finding out something new. It's primarily to find out something new or contribute something novelly. So that is the purpose of research. It is not just the reproduction of somebody else. So preliminary research would give you an insight as to what are the things which are already being done and what are the things which you need to do in that particular field of the study. And in all probability, most of you should be knowing that with respect to PhD thesis, now currently we are having Shodh Ganga, right? So we have a system of a website, Shodh Ganga, wherein almost all the PhD theses of the recent past, especially of the say 21st century, whatever theses have been actually awarded, the database you can find it Shodh Ganga, and you can go through that and find out is there any already existing work which has been done to avoid the duplication. Of course, I'm not just telling about only Shodh Ganga. You can also go through, say, abroad universities' websites and all, wherein the information about the PhD thesis would be available. There would also be information available with respect to the other projects, research projects and all, whatever has been done in the area. So, which would all give an insight as to what is already being traveled through and what you need to do for the purpose of value addition. So that is why I should say that the preliminary research is the starting point of your research. That is the starting point, and everything else derives from this preliminary research, whatever you're going to do. Now, coming to the writing of the research proposal. Once the preliminary research is done, the very next stage is to go for the writing of the research proposal. What and all should be the content of the research proposal? To start with, an introduction. Obviously, every research proposal need to have an introduction, laying out the background of the research, as well as suppose if you are addressing any concept in your research work, you may address that concept also in the introduction. If I have to give a simple example, maybe if you are working on medical negligence in light of Consumer Protection Act or something like that, you are working on that particular topic. Then, if you'd like to elaborate on the concept of medical negligence, you can include that right after the introduction, or maybe the part of the introduction itself. You can include it. But there may be a situation wherein you may keep this as a separate chapter. Maybe in the second chapter, you might be trying to define all the concepts or trying to tell about the historical background. So in those circumstances, I would suggest you not to go for having the concept in the introduction. Just write a background of the research topic. And let me also tell you, background doesn't mean you start from the historical point of view. Introduction is not that mentioning what happened during Shushruta's time or what happened during Charaka's time on the medical negligence. That is not the introduction. Introduction is to your topic, whatever topic you are taking. If you are taking medical negligence in the context of maybe Consumer Protection Act, then introduction to that in terms of the existing scenario. What's happening at present? And it needs to be very brief. You are not supposed to write a 10-page introduction or 20-page introduction. Unless you discuss the concept. If you are discussing the concept, yes, you may have to go to around 10 pages. for discussing that. That's a different thing. But otherwise, if you are giving only the background of the research topic, I should say that 1.5 to 2 pages should be sufficient as introduction. Not more than 1.5 to 2 pages. That's it. That should be the brief introduction to your research proposal. The second major thing which you should have in a research proposal is the statement of problems. And let me tell you that this is the most significant step in any research proposal. If you have to draft a convincing research proposal, what is most significant is a very, very strong statement of problems. Very, very strong statement of problems. You need to identify sufficient problems so that you can justify an extended research. If you are working for 3 years or 4 years for your PhD, or maybe a major research project for 2 years or more than that, or even for a dissertation, if you have to work for a year, right? Of course, minimum 6 months in case of actually the 1 year LLM. But if you have 2 years LLM, of course, 1 year you should devote for your dissertation. Almost 1 year you have to devote for it. So for that extended research, you have to show that there is a sufficient problem in your area of the research. There is sufficient number of problems. And it should exhaustively cover your topic. Suppose if you are basically taking a topic generally on medical negligence in India. Medical negligence in India. You should not confine the statement of problem only to one aspect. Like say, for example, only Consumer Protection Act or only tort law. You can't do that because actually you have taken a broader topic of medical negligence in India. So all laws, whether it is consumer law, tort law, or criminal law, all of them should come within the ambit of your statement of problem. Please keep in mind that choosing a topic is also very important, the title, because that title has to be reflected throughout your actually the research proposal. Right? All components which I'm basically trying to tell you here, they should be in consonance with your title. Right? Either the title should not be so broad and your components do not address that, or title should not be very narrow, your component address more things than what is mentioned in the title. Neither of them should happen. Right? Neither of them should happen. So in accordance with the title of your research, if you have taken generally on medical negligence, you need to look into all 3 major areas. If you have taken only on Consumer Protection Act, your statement of problems should be confined only to consumer protection. That's how you have to tailor the statement of problems. And when I say there should be sufficient problems, exhaustive coverage, I recollect, I have seen actually many research proposals wherein the researchers would write almost 10 to 12 pages generally about introduction. Starting from, as I said, actually historical background, what happened, say 20 centuries back, and also all those different things would be written there. Some 10, 12 pages stories written. Then a statement of problem of half a page or a 3/4 of a page. I should say it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense because actually you have to be crisp with respect to your introduction, but statement of problem need to be very elaborate, identifying each of the problems which you are going to discuss in the subsequent chapters. So I don't foresee a possibility of writing your statement of problem in less than 4 or 5 pages. At least 4 or 5 pages, you have to elaborate, right? Even if you on different areas, whatever problems which you are identifying, even if you can write 1 page on that, you should be able to have 3, 4, 5 pages easily. Easily 4 or 5 pages. If you can't write 4 to 5 pages in the statement of problem, mind it, you would not be able to write a 200 pages thesis. You would not be able to do that, right? So therefore, and also another thing is that this requires the preliminary research, the strong preliminary research, which would help you to develop the statement of problems. Otherwise, most of the times, this half a page statement or 3/4 of a page of a statement of problem, they come primarily because the researcher has not done the preliminary research adequately. That is the basic problem. So let me advise anyone who is doing the research at present that focus on your statement of problem. Develop it in such a convincing way that anyone who is actually, say, going through that, or maybe who is actually, say, evaluating your the research proposal would be convinced. Right? So, therefore, statement of problem is very significant in terms of your research proposal. Then comes the research questions. If you ask me, what is the difference between the statement of problems and research questions? I should say none. No difference. Only difference is that in the statement of problems, you should have discussed the problem in detail. Here, you are going to narrate the questions specifically. In a simple way, these are the XYZ questions which I'm going to address in my research. That is it. Concretization of the problems, that is the only thing which is going to be done out of the research questions. Right? So I will be looking into 1, 2, 3. These are the things. That's what you have to basically do it. And let me tell you, it is not just the question, rather the research question. It is the research question. That means there should be sufficient scope for research. It's not an examination question. Not asking, like actually say, what are the different laws prevailing in India with respect to protection of consumers in case of medical negligence? This is not a research question. What are you going to research? Right? So you will write about actually what are the laws, different laws which are existing in India. That's it. No research. Right? So it is not like that. So the research question should be developed in such a way that there is a sufficient scope to go through different literature or have a field study and then ultimately come to the conclusion whether there is an answer to a particular the question, whatever question it is, what kind of answer should be given to that kind of that question. So there should be sufficient scope for the research, and more importantly, every question almost need to be developed as one entire chapter. One entire chapter. Right? Or there may also be a situation wherein one question may have to be addressed in 2 or more chapters. Your one research question has to be addressed in 2 or more chapters, a chapter of maybe 40 pages. So that much content should be there, right? Within a question which you're going to pose. It's not a kind of an yes or no answer question. Yes or no kind of a question. No, you should not have it like that. Rather, it should be in such a way that there is a sufficient scope to probe into the existing literature as well as the ground realities and come to a conclusion on those questions. These questions need to be addressed in subsequent chapters, and that is why I would suggest not to have more than 3 to 4 research questions. Whether it is dissertation or PhD, there is no possibility of answering more than 3 to 4 research questions. I'm not telling about questions per se. There is no possibility of answering more than 3 to 4 research questions if you have properly narrowed down your research topic and if you are doing a good research. Sometimes I have seen as many as 10 research questions, 12 research questions written by the researcher. It doesn't show any kind of a credibility. Number of research questions are more, therefore you are doing a fantastic work. That's not the impression. Right? So that shows your ignorance, that you are putting certain things which are not researchable questions, rather some random examination questions. Or maybe it shows as if you have not concretely demarcated your area of the study in the proper way. Not chosen a topic which is actually narrow enough, but at the same point of time, it is not very narrow. So it's sufficient for a kind of a research, right? So that would be reflected only when you have proper research questions. There are some scholars who say that entire PhD can also be done with only one research question. There's a possibility of one research question, right, being part of the probe in the entire PhD thesis. That's very much possible. So therefore, please keep in mind that number of research questions would not actually in any way give an additional credibility for your research work. Keep it as minimum as possible, 3 to 4, and very crisp. Research question should also be very crisp. Let me give you an example to say what is the wrong way of going for the research question. Probably let me take an example from space law itself, wherein I work more extensively. See, maybe a question tailored like this: whether the space environmental concerns at present are a significant concerns? Question mark. If so, what need to be done for sorting it out? Let me repeat. Whether the space environmental concerns, maybe space debris issues, whether it is a significant problem for the mankind at present, and a follow-up question: if so, what measures need to be taken to tackle the situation? This kind of questions I have seen quite common in many research proposals. To my personal view, it is a very, very wrong way of framing the question. It's a wrong way of framing the question, because your second question is completely dependent on the answer to the first question. If you have carefully heard my example, your second part of question, if so, what measures need to be taken to tackle the situation? That is dependent on the answer to the first question. In the first question, if you get an answer no, right? Like say, for example, space debris is not a major problem at all, right? If you get an answer to the no, what are you going to do with the second question? Your second question is redundant, right? And also it reflects that you are going for the second part of the question with the preconceived notion bias that you will get a positive answer for the first question. You will get a positive answer for the first question. What kind of a research question it is? It is not a research question, because you have already hypothesized that actually there would be a positive answer. Space debris is a big problem, or space environmental concern is a big problem. Therefore, we have to tackle it. I hope that it is making sense, right? So therefore, what I'm telling you is that don't structure your questions in such a way, or don't go for having sub-questions within the question, multiple questions, right? Wherein you make one part of the question redundant by virtue of having some kind of a thing in some other part, right? So that is about actually the research questions. Next, hypotheses. Let me again start with the caveat on the hypothesis. The caveat is that in a law research, hypothesis is not a must. It is not a must. Many of you might be surprised, because actually, as a matter of a tradition, everyone has seen hypothesis in the research proposal. Everyone might have seen it. Hypothesis is of course in the other social sciences. When you look into the other social science methodology and all, hypothesis is considered to be something absolutely essential. In other social sciences, yes, right? So hypothesis is considered to be something required, and a researcher would always test the hypothesis in the course of the research. But if you go through the law and the methodology which has been used for the purpose of the legal research, historically, you don't find the hypothesis as a must. What has happened is that over the period of the time, people have seen hypothesis so much in the social science subjects that they started to presume that hypothesis is must in all subjects. If you don't write hypothesis, there is no mistake, but evaluators would always think that, oh, hypothesis is missing. When your thesis goes for the evaluation, you would definitely get a comment from the evaluator that the researcher should have had a hypothesis or could have had a hypothesis. It would be framed in different manner. That's a different issue. Maybe in polite way or in a rude way, whatever it may be, they will point it out. So that is the problem. But otherwise, hypothesis is not a must for a legal research. Now, presuming that it has become a kind of a practice, let me just briefly touch upon the hypothesis. Of course, all of you must be knowing that hypothesis is nothing but a kind of a proposition or a supposition with which the researcher is proceeding initially after the preliminary research. Because after a preliminary research on a particular topic, you would definitely be having some impression on your research questions. Say on medical negligence itself, if you have a question like how far the Consumer Protection Act in India is good enough for the purpose of dealing with different issues in medical negligence, you might be having a research question like that. Now, after the preliminary research, you might have come to the conclusion, of course, it's a preliminary conclusion, preliminary proposition, that yes, consumer protection is problematic. There are some issues, like the members of the consumer fora, consumer courts, they are not well versed to deal with the medical negligence cases. Or you might have a kind of a proposition that the Consumer Protection Act gives very less time for the purpose of dealing with the issues, and complicated cases like the medical negligence should not fall within the ambit of the Consumer Protection Act. You might have some kind of actually the proposition after the preliminary research. So you'll be narrating that in the hypothesis. And there are two things which I should specifically mention about hypothesis. One, hypothesis should never be assumed as truth. There is always a tendency of a researcher that I have already told something earlier, so let me now try to establish that that is correct. Throughout the researcher trying to say that whatever I have told in the beginning is correct. This is an absolute wrong approach to the research. Because when you developed your hypothesis, you have done only your preliminary research. You never completed the research. It is just a preliminary research, some data you have already referred to, and you have to do the major research after the proposal only, after having the hypothesis. So, if you consider that the initial proposition or supposition is correct, no changes required, you are trying to establish that that is truth, then where is the scope for the research? You have closed your mind. You have closed your mind for any kind of actually the other opinion, and you say that what I say is correct. That's it. So whatever data you are going to get subsequently, whatever research you are going to do, that is waste of time, because you are trying to use all those tools for the purpose of supporting your hypothesis. Instead of telling the truth, what is correct? No, you are not doing that. Instead, you go for actually supporting your initial proposition. And I should say that that is the end of the research. It's a preconceived notion bias. You would ultimately actually end up in testifying your preconceived notion bias. So don't assume the hypothesis as true. You should test the hypothesis through the course of the research. And if you find towards the end that your initial hypothesis is not correct, don't have any hesitation in saying that your hypothesis is wrong. Your hypothesis is wrong. Because the evaluators would look into your research on the basis of your reasons for the conclusion. Are you testifying your hypothesis? Are you proving your hypothesis? Not relevant at all. If the evidences are against your hypothesis, you should definitely disprove your hypothesis and say these are the reasons why you find that the hypothesis is incorrect. You should do that, right? And it's an equally good research. So don't think that if you prove your hypothesis only, it's a great research. Otherwise, it is not a great research. It's an absolutely fantastic research if you can actually disprove your hypothesis with the help of proper reasons. So that's the first thing. Second thing, tailoring a hypothesis is an art. I don't know how many of the participants today have already faced some presentation with respect to your PhD proposal or LLM dissertation proposal, whatever it may. I am sure that each one of you must have been tested on your hypothesis. Different people saying that, okay, your hypothesis is not correct. If you are before an expert, the panel, they will say that your hypothesis is not structured properly. I think majority of you would agree with my opinion. Why? Because there is nothing precise for hypothesis. It's an art. You have to perform this particular art in a fantastic manner to have a proper hypothesis. Hypothesis, first of all, should not be lengthy, not half a page, 1 page hypothesis. It should be very short, very short. Number 2, hypothesis should not mention generally the facts. It's like saying that medical negligence is a great problem in India. Every year we have got 500 cases being filed in every state within India. 2021, this much of problem have happened. They're all not the problem of your hypothesis, not the part of your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is a kind of an answer to your research question. And that too, you have to do it in maybe a couple of sentences, not more than that, very short. But then it doesn't mean that you generally mention, very vaguely you mention that all laws in India with respect to medical negligence are irrelevant, they're absurd. So we have to develop new laws. This is also not a hypothesis. This is also not a hypothesis. So this can be said by any Tom, Dick, and Harry that everything is a first, we need to develop new things. That is not the way of tailoring the hypothesis. While tailoring the hypothesis, facts may be used, but you need to use it cleverly. You need to use it cleverly. I'm not going to say that actually this is the perfect example, but still, if I have to quote an example, right, because it differs actually, so it depends on the topic, whatever you're going to take. If maybe on the medical negligence aspect itself, so suppose if somebody is working on the Consumer Protection Act, whether the consumer courts are efficient enough to deal with the medical negligence cases. So that may be a topic. Your hypothesis might run like this. Like say, given the fact that there has been a considerable increase in the number of medical negligence cases coming before the consumer courts in India, and also the maybe the time limit, whatever has been provided under the Consumer Protection Act, there is a concern with respect to dealing the medical negligence under the Consumer Protection Act, or maybe before the consumer courts. There is a problem by virtue of that. That can be your hypothesis. You're mentioning the facts very briefly that yes, there is an increase in the number of consumer protection cases under the medical negligence. You're also mentioning that Consumer Protection Act has a problem in terms of the tight time schedule. Consumer courts might not be able to address them properly within a short span of time, right? So you're including that in one statement itself. Plus, you're also mentioning that we need to consider some better alternatives. Better alternatives. That is your proposition. That is your presumption, right? And you're going to testify that. You're going to actually test it throughout the research, find out whether you are correct that the time gap is not sufficient, whether you are correct in terms of increasing number of cases, which is adding on burden to the consumer courts, whether you are correct in terms of these hypotheses, that you can actually test it in the course of the research. So that is why it's definitely an art, and you have to perform it like an artist. Next, the next part is about the objectives of the study. I have seen, again, in many research proposals, most of these things are written as a kind of a ritual. Objectives of the research. Many of them would say that I have an objective to go through the Consumer Protection Act, decode the problems, whatever are existing therein. I have an objective to actually find out whether the consumer courts are functioning or not. All those kind of stuffs are mentioned usually in the objectives of the research. I should say that most of these things would come within the ambit of your scope of the research, not objectives. Objectives of your research is the intended outcome of your research. or deliverables, right? The intended deliverables, what you are going to achieve out of your research. Suppose if you are working on medical negligence, what is your ulterior purpose? You might have actually something in your mind to make reforms in law, right? The new laws to be introduced, or you might have actually a kind of a thinking that administration of the law has to be strengthened, some better administrative mechanism need to be brought in, right? Or ultimately, you might also have a kind of a deliverable or purported objective that your research should benefit the society in some way. It should benefit the society in some way, or maybe it is going to value, it's going to bring a kind of a value addition to the existing field of knowledge. How exactly all these things happen? Would there be value addition? Would there be benefit to the society? Would there be requirement of a change in the law or reforms in the administration? These things would be part of your objectives of the research. They should be part of objectives of the research. Next, scope of the study. Scope of the study is very essential for the purpose of providing the area of coverage. Area of the coverage, what you are going to cover. Scope is not the importance of the study, rather the area of coverage of the study. Right? So you have to mention under the scope of the study what aspect you are going to cover in your thesis and what aspect you are not going to cover in your thesis. I should say that what you are not going to cover in your thesis should be properly reflected in the scope of the research. This helps you in terms of not deviating from your topic subsequently when you are writing your thesis, right? So this helps you from actually not deviating from whatever core research which you are doing. So write what you are going to cover and what you are not going to cover. Again, let me tell you that this scope of the study should also be in consonance with the title, the topic which you have mentioned. Suppose if the topic is consumer protection law in India in the context of a medical negligence or medical negligence under the consumer protection law. In the scope of the study, you cannot say that this thesis would cover Consumer Protection Act, criminal negligence, or maybe tort law negligence. You cannot say that. You should say that maybe especially negligence under the criminal law would not be a part of this study. That has to be pointed out. Similarly, if you are making a comparative study, right? If you have a comparison with other jurisdictions, what jurisdictions you are going to cover and what you are not going to cover with the proper reason. With the proper reason should be mentioned in the scope of the study. That should be mentioned in the scope of the study. So it helps in terms of preventing deviation from the core area, number one. And number two, it also helps a reader. Whenever somebody actually is reading your thesis, they would be able to appreciate that the researcher has not taken other areas which are missing in the thesis. If a researcher has taken only consumer protection law with respect to medical negligence, and then the evaluator is going through your thesis, if you have not demarcated the Consumer Protection Act or consumer protection law in the scope of the study, evaluator might feel that there is also negligence under tort law, there is also negligence under the criminal law. So researcher has not looked into that. That is what would happen. So therefore, scope of the study, first of all, helps you in keeping on track, not deviating from your research area. Second, even for the reader, it helps to appreciate the limitations of the research. Next, literature review. Literature review is not writing down the bibliography. I have again seen research proposals wherein, say, 100 different resources are mentioned under the literature review. That is not the purpose of literature review. Literature review is for the purpose of analyzing the existing literature. Of course, you might not be able to analyze the plethora of the literature at this stage because you have just done the preliminary research. It's only a preliminary research which you have completed for the research proposal. So you might get some major sources, some 15, 20 sources, whatever you are having. You might have to actually analyze that in the literature. Each of these literature, you have to write a paragraph on them. You have to write a paragraph. What is the crux of the argument which the author is taking in that literature? And then how it is relevant for your research. How is that relevant for your research? Maybe in first chapter, second chapter, or somewhere in the middle or towards the end. Where is it relevant for your thesis? That need to be written in the literature review. It is not enlisting the sources, right? And of course, if there are, say, 2 or more sources which are having the common argument, some 3, 4 authors actually in different articles are writing the same thing. There is no difference in their argument. Then you can club them together and write in one paragraph. This author in this particular paper, this author in his book like this, they've all argued for this or argued like this. And this argument would be relevant for my discussion in subsequent chapter, somewhere in the middle. Right? So that should be reflected in the literature review in each of those paragraphs. And more importantly, literature review should always end with 1 or 2 paragraphs mentioning how your research is different from existing literature. This I find missing in many of the research proposals, whatever comes to me for the evaluation, right? So they would not write it towards the end. How is that their research is different from existing literature? That is the most significant thing, because that shows how novel is your research. Despite the fact that there are literature available on the area which you are going to cover, since there are certain things which are not addressed in those literature, I am looking into that. That should be shown to the reader. That should be shown to the reader. So that is why most important thing in the literature review is that to mention how exactly your study or your research is different from existing literature. So this is about literature review. Then comes the research methodology. Again, not a charity of 1 paragraph. You need to detail out what exactly you are going to do. It may be a doctrinal research or empirical research, field study. Of course, nowadays you can find that the field study or empirical research has gained more significance than just the doctrinal research. But you have to mention specifically what kind of methodology you are adopting. There may be certain kind of actually the area wherein empirical research might not be possible. One can understand about the only doctrinal research. But wherever there is a possibility of empirical study, one has to go for it. One has to go for it. Right? So that is absolutely required, because the stakeholders' input into your research is something which makes it quite novel. So therefore, empirical research has gained increased significance, and one need to think in terms of how to go for the field study. Field study might involve different methods like sampling, or maybe actually say interviews, schedules, or maybe say observation. So participatory method, different kind of actually methods may be there as a part and parcel of the empirical research. But the researcher has to mention how exactly those different kind of actually the methods would be used in the course of the research. So for example, if sampling is going to be used, how the samples are supposed to be collected, right? So suppose if it's a pan-India study, then probably it is not possible to go to every state and collect data from the stakeholders. You may have to select certain states, but that should be with proper reasoning. Maybe geographical representation, north, south, east, west, and center of India, like that, some 5 states selecting. Or alternatively, selecting certain states wherein the problems are more. Domestic violence, where so you have reported cases, more reported cases. Select those states. Select the states, maybe if you are having on environmental impact assessment, select those states wherein the more industries are operating. Right? So like that, so you should have some reason for the selection of the sample, and that reason has to be mentioned in the research methodology. Then tools, different kind of tools which are going to be used in different parts of your research. Like say historical method, analytical and critical method, comparative method, if you are comparing the Indian situation with UK or Brazil, whatever other countries it may be in your research, right? So what kind of tools you're going to use for implementing your research has to be mentioned. Plus, kind of data. What primary data, what secondary data. I'm not telling you to enlist all of them. That is not supposed to be here in the research methodology. That would be in the bibliography. Here, you have to just mention primary data like, say, legislation, international treaties, conventions, etc. are being referred to. Secondary data like textbooks, commentaries, or maybe articles in the journals, online resources, like that. So all of them would be referred in your research, has to be mentioned in the research methodology. So it is something which need to be very strongly reflected and properly mentioning about how do you carry on the research. That is very significant in a research proposal. Next is the tentative chapterization. How do you chapterize? How do you chalk out the report writing? What is the plan? Of course, this entire plan emanates from your research questions themselves. Research questions, right? So research question and hypothesis, both of them need to be adequately looked into and tested in your research in different chapters. If you have 3 research questions, probably those 3 research questions will be addressed in 3 different chapters. You might be doing that. And your hypothesis has to be tested throughout in your research. And you should also keep in mind that there should be continuity of the argument. There should be continuity of the argument in chapterization. Chapter 2 should derive from chapter 1. Chapter 3, towards the end of chapter 2, whatever is there, from there it should be continued in chapter 3. Like that, establishing the continuity is very significant, and it is not just actually writing something randomly. So you have to have that continuity of the argument in the tentative chapterization. Of course, you can change that. I'm not saying that actually the chapterization, what you have initially, you have to stick to that throughout the course of the research. No, because in the course of your research, you might find that there is a requirement of some changes. You can very well do that. Finally, the last thing which I would like to tell in the research proposal would be a tentative bibliography, and list whatever major sources which you have referred to, mention it as a kind of a tentative bibliography in the research proposal itself. This is relevant for 2 reasons. One, that as a researcher, you will get confidence. Your confidence would be boosted that I have this much of literature, I would be able to do a good research, right? At least that would be there as a kind of a researcher in the initial stage itself. Second, this would also help anyone who is going through your proposal to give a feedback on the additional data. When you submit your proposal to an expert group, or maybe to your teacher, guide, or whosoever it may be, they will go through your tentative bibliography and find out what are the major literature which are missing in your tentative bibliography. And accordingly, they can suggest you to go through those the data, which would definitely be helpful to you as a researcher to do a good research. To do a good research. This is all briefly about actually the drafting of a research proposal, how to make it in a convincing way. Of course, there's a lot more things to say about it, but I wanted to reserve some time for actually the discussion. So if there is any question, I would be really happy to answer those questions. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
Thank you so much, sir, for filling us with awe and joy of your wisdom. Now, if anyone have any queries, please raise your hand in the Zoom app. Yeah. Yeah, we have 2 participants. Mr. Jeet Singh Man, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Very good afternoon, Professor. A very good lecture on how to formulate a research proposal and certain observations, and then one particular question, not research question. Right. See, why we have that confusion between law and social science. And we feel that law is very different from social science. With respect to research methodology also, we need to have a separate research methodology for law. Now, can we do any research without understanding social science? A research in isolation, number one. Number two, we also talked about hypothesis. That hypothesis is not a must in case of law. So it is again well-established principle that it is the nature of research that will dictate the requirement of hypothesis. In case of explanatory research, of course, hypothesis is a must. You may have hypothesis in case of exploratory research. Now, coming back to certain observations made by you regarding a review of literature. See, review of literature is not a form of annotated bibliography, which is very different from bibliography. So, review of literature, it should not be in a list form, like you provide lists, so many articles, etc., etc. So, finally, my question is, can you provide a model research proposal, contents of research proposal, like you have included review of literature, I think almost in the mid of that the discussion. So do you think research question is a starting point or research problem, or maybe that review of literature, that should be the starting point? And what can be the contents of a model research proposal? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you for those questions, Professor Singh. Yeah. I'm meeting you after a long time. Yeah, good to hear questions from you as well. As far as actually the hypothesis is concerned, I'm not contesting that hypothesis should not be there as a part of the legal research. I'm not telling that actually. What I'm trying to tell you is that actually, as a matter of practice, earlier it was not part of the law. Right? I'm not saying that law is something entirely different from the social science. That's not my basic argument. But as a matter of practice, over the period of other time, in the legal research, we don't find actually many people using the hypothesis. But over the period of time, we have actually imported that from other social sciences. And most people believe that it's now part and parcel of actually the legal research proposal as well. So that's why I just said that it is not a must as we go by the legal tradition or maybe the legal research tradition. That's the first thing. Then second, as far as the review of literature is concerned, I'm not telling to enlist them like a bibliography. I'm not telling you to do it like an annotated bibliography. What I'm telling is that actually each of the research, or each of the existing literature need to be analyzed by the researcher in each paragraph separately, so that actually the researcher can show that researcher has adequately understood the existing literature, and the researcher can also reflect that this is going to be used in a particular manner in the research. Right? So it's certain portions wherever actually the discussion is supposed to be done, so it can be used therein. That is what actually is reflected out of the review of literature. And I also said that how it is different, how the research of a particular person is different from existing literature. That should also be a part of the literature review. Definitely, it is not an annotated bibliography as such. I'm basically pointing out. And then with respect to the last issue, that is, should the literature review come first? The research questions should come first. What should come first and all actually? Debate is definitely there. There is no doubt that there is the debate. Some people say that literature review should become before actually the statement of problem and the research question. Soon after the introduction, the literature review should come. Whatever way it may be, I don't have any problem. It need not be structured in the same way as I basically pointed out in my presentation. Literature review may be preceding actually the statement of problem. It may be towards the end as well, because simply because it is towards the end, it does not mean that the review of literature is not done before having the statement of problem. Only thing is that you are sequencing it towards the end. So for going by that, actually even research methodology for that matter, that is essential since the beginning itself. Why shouldn't you put the research methodology in the beginning? That would also be another argument with respect to structuring. So whatever it may be, what I'm trying to point out is that actually these are the major parameters which need to be there in the research proposal, so that a convincing proposal can be drafted by a researcher.
Next, Mr. Viz Bilagi may unmute and ask a question.
Am I audible? Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. You may
Yeah,
ask.
ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. My question is, the speaker said that, Bhat sir said that we have to have an hypothesis which has to, which may be, I mean, it's a hypothetical problem. It may be proved, it may not be proved. In case it is not proved by my empirical research or whatever I am trying to, testing the hypothesis, how do you think will the guide take it? Whether it will be valued in that way, because my topic is concerning the accessibility and quality dimensions of the Right to Education Act. So, given in a particular area, I'm looking at the implementation of this particular act from these two dimensions in a given area. So, if I cannot prove the hypothesis, is it going to be detrimental to my research or whatever? I just wanted to have a clarification regarding that, sir.
No, I should say that your guide should always take it sportively. I mean, I have always taken actually suppose if somebody disproves the hypothesis, I have taken it sportively.
Yes,
and more importantly, suppose if actually your data shows that your hypothesis is wrong. If you try to prove the hypothesis contrary to the field study or your data, then your entire research is actually gone. So you are not researching, rather you are trying to establish something which is there as a kind of a presumption in your mind, isn't it?
Yes.
So therefore, you should not worry whether the guide would feel bad for that or maybe anyone else would be feeling bad for that. To my understanding,
yes, sir, it's always like, either the hypothesis is either proved or not proved. Therefore, whatever the problem is, in most of the cases, it is like it is proved, and therefore the suggestions and conclusions in the last part or in the last thing carry whatever suggestions are being given by the researcher, that this is the possible solution for that so-called problem that I have proved through my research. Right now, the thing is, if this thing doesn't get proved, I can say that if the children there are having good access to the area which I have taken under empirical study, have good access, wherein I had taken it as a hypothesis or as a hypothetical problem that there is a problem of accessibility and quality dimensions for this area regarding the Right to Education Act implementation. So if I just don't prove that and it just give the bare facts as it is, whether the thesis can be rejected is what I'm asking you, sir.
No, I should say that actually such a kind of a conclusion would not usually come. You would not be coming to the conclusion that your hypothesis is completely wrong, especially in the kind of the research which you are doing. Right? You might get a conclusion that your hypothesis is partially correct. That might be possible, right? One part of it is not correct.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
you
sir,
might,
very correct.
You might say, for example, you might be having a hypothesis that actually the law is not adequate, and also you might have a hypothesis that administration is also not proper. Actually, you might have it like that, right? I'm just generally telling.
Not proper.
But then, then you might get a kind of, you might get a conclusion that law is adequate, but your administration is not proper. In those places, administration is not happening in a proper manner, right? So in that way, your final conclusion would be maybe that actually the part of your hypothesis is proved and the remaining part is disproved. That's what would happen. Otherwise, if actually your entire hypothesis goes after the research, actually everything is perfect scenario, if that comes in as a kind of an answer, I should say that your preliminary research was inadequate. I told you actually you have to start your research with the preliminary research. You will be doing initially some research to find out that yes, there is a problem existing, isn't it? Right? Without that, actually, you would not have proceeded with the research. So you have done that preliminary research. Right? In the preliminary research, you might not have got a concrete idea as to what is not working properly, but at least you should have got an idea as to something is not working properly. Isn't it? Either law or administration. Something is not working properly. So you must have got that much at least in the preliminary research. So once that is the case, your hypothesis would also carry forward that, saying that there are multiple issues existing therein, and you're going to test it in the course of time. And towards then, you may come to the conclusion that yes, law is perfect, no problem. We have done actually the best of the efforts in terms of legislation, but administration is problematic because of some stakeholders actually incapacity. Right? So it would come. I mean, of course, I mean, I can't foresee a situation wherein your hypothesis, especially when you structure it like that, would be completely dismantled towards that. It would not happen usually.
Now, Mr. Madhav Raja, may I unmute and ask?
Hello, good afternoon, sir. Sir, I have like two questions to ask. Firstly, with regard to, sir, how much, I mean, when we do the conceptual clarity that we have to do in the introduction with regard to the research proposal, how should we actually approach the method of the doing conceptual clarity with our topic? And what all things we should include when we actually do an empirical research, what all things we should have a clarity in the introduction chapter. And secondly, my question would be, sir, actually you mentioned that we should actually limit the number of research questions. So when we do the research proposal, as sir has also mentioned that we are actually doing the preliminary research, so we are flooded with a lot of questions. And because when we think about the topic, we are actually encountered with a lot of questions. So I took an approach like I have like one question per one chapter that I have tentatively proposed. So how can we actually balance that forward? So this will be my two questions.
Okay. So with respect to the second question, which you have pointed out, probably again, I should say that if you have done your preliminary research very strongly, you would be able to structure the question in such a way that you can discuss that in one chapter or maybe more than one chapter, right? So answer may be found in actually more than the one chapter actually. So that is very much feasible even with your preliminary research. So simply thinking that, okay, I might fall short of the question and I need to write so much of a thesis of 200 pages and all, therefore I need to have more research question. That would not justify, because ultimately towards the end, if you don't address certain research questions as mentioned in your initial research proposal, your research is inadequate, it's incomplete. That would be a problem. So your proposal, when you are tailoring in the beginning itself, you have to ensure that actually you are closing the entire aspect in terms of problems and research questions. Unless there is some new development, which in the course of your research, you find that it need to be addressed. It's very essential to address the existing issues. Unless and until that is the scenario, you should not add any new questions, or you should also not delete the existing questions. So that's why I should say that research questions need to be as minimum as possible, and you have to do actually the preliminary research to tailor it in a perfect manner. I think the first question I forgot that actually. So can you just remind me? What is your first question?
Mr. Madhav Raja, can you please repeat your first question?
Sir, my first question was, my guide has actually instructed me to provide a conceptual clarity with regard to my topic. Sir, actually, I'm researching on the issues of landless people in India and the identity crisis they are facing. So actually, I have to have a conceptual clarity with regard to what the concept of self-identity mean with respect to the social circumstances and the legal system in India, as well as how a particular person who is actually not deprived of land is actually facing a situation of identity crisis. So I've been instructed to actually provide conceptual clarity with regard to all the new concepts that actually I'm providing in my research. So I'm still stuck with the point wherein how deep should I go with regard to conceptual clarity, and how much should I provide it in my introduction, which I am actually planning to provide in the research proposal.
Understood the question. Yeah. See, I mean, especially in the kind of the topic which you have chosen would require initial, even actually a kind of a field study also. Probably you may have to actually contact certain people who are working in this area, maybe an NGO or maybe some other actually the organizations which are working in this area. Try to collect the data and then actually have a kind of a clarity about the ambit of your research. That is something required, especially when you are trying to take a particular issue which is connected with the people in certain regions, or maybe people of certain kind of actually the sect, etc., class or religion, sect, whatever it may be. So in those cases, your preliminary research need to be much more stronger than the other circumstances wherein you are going for the doctoral research. Right? So probably you have to include a little bit of an empirical component, or maybe at least actually consult with a few stakeholders and get an idea about what are the problems which they are facing and structure your statement of problem. And probably, I think you also mentioned about how clear you should be about your research methodology also. That's what you asked previously. Yes, there might be possibility that you are not very clear about it right now, because you don't know whether the stakeholders are all educated, or are there actually any kind of a problem in terms of education, whether questionnaire would work, whether interview would work, which one would better work, you might not be having the clarity right now. But still, by looking into the existing scenario, what and all methods you can use, you can just mention that in your research proposal, right? How can you approach with that? Then you can just mention it. Maybe with the preliminary consultation itself, with the NGOs or maybe some other stakeholders, you should be able to also figure out, is it that questionnaire which should work, interview, participatory method, which is going to work for you. You can basically make a conclusion on that aspect.
Okay, now Ms. Vijayalakshmi can unmute and ask.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Yeah, it's a wonderful clarity, actually, wonderful lecture. It's a very well, I am clarified. You have clarified so many things because I did recently I presented the research proposal, but though I am satisfied, but it did not go well with this thing. So I got little less marks because one wrong I have done it, that chapterization I didn't mention. I did not write the chapterization, one thing. Second thing, I narrowed down the area of my empirical study, but I haven't narrowed down the particular field. For example, that unorganized workers in that particular Madurai area, I have narrowed down. That doubt I had it, whether I do anything wrong in a great way. That I want to know it from you, whether narrowing down to that particular area, is it also necessary to narrow down to that particular thing? Because if I am caliber, I have the caliber to do research more for 2 or 3 fields more. For example, not only the brick workers, but also I can add the weavers. I can add, if I have the caliber, instead of narrowing down to the one particular weavers, one particular area, if I broader my research area to 2, 3, that went wrong. Or chapterization I didn't write, whether it is a very great mistake, but I got the admission and I got my other things right. But this thing I want to know. And also the first sir said that there is no outline for presenting the research proposal. It's not in India. I have searched with every university has their own outline of bringing the research proposal. The order is random, order is up and down, it's going down, but not a firm. If it is empirical study, then you have to present the research proposal in this way. If the doctoral research, you have to present in this way. Aim, objective, that what is the chapterization, and hypothesis and conclusion, whatever it is, bibliography. If it is in a constructed way, maybe the research scholars like us, in future they may have a clear idea. This is what I want to ask you, sir. Thank you for the clarification. I'm waiting.
Thank you so much for some of the interesting questions. Yeah, so the last thing, yes, there is no standard format. If you look into the Indian, I mean, any university for that matter, they would be having a different format with respect to the proposal. But of course, in one or other way, whatever I have discussed would be reflected in their research proposal. Somehow, actually, it would be reflected therein. I mean, some titles may be different, but still, it would be reflected more or less in almost all universities' research proposal. Now, the 2 other questions, I mean, you spoke about the chapterization, missing chapterization, whether that was a problem, or is it that you have not narrowed down the topic specifically to a particular area of unorganized sector? Was that a problem in your interview you said, actually? It could have been both. To my understanding, it could have been both. Because tentative chapterization is something required, because unless and until you have that in furtherance of the research questions, you'll not be able to concretely go with the, say, particular chapter. Say, I mean, usually what happens is that when you collect the data, you will organize it into different chapters, right? You'll not be randomly collecting the data, randomly reading them, and randomly rating them. It is not like that. You should be collecting it and then classifying that into maybe different questions as well as different chapters, then read it and write it accordingly for the respective chapters. So that is why chapterization is essential in a research proposal. And of course, it should carry forward from your research questions itself. 3 or 4 research questions, whatever you are having, chapterization should be in accordance with that. You can have that. Then, on narrowing down your topic to a particular unorganized sector, maybe I think Madurai you said, if I'm not mistaken, you're working into Madurai. Yeah. That, with respect to that, it depends on the kind of topic. You see, if you have done a field study, if you have gone there to Madurai, and if you have found how many sectors are there, unorganized sectors are there, how many people are working in each of those sectors, then you have to make a final conclusion as to whether you have to take one single sector or you can take all the sectors holistically. Because while you pick the research topic, you should ensure that it is not very narrow so that ultimately you end up in an article. At the same point of time, it is not so broad wherein actually you have to write 1,000 pages. Right? Because unorganized sector also, in that a different unorganized sector might have different kind of features. There might be a possibility that you say BD workers in Madurai might be facing some kind of a problem. Unorganized sector people are having some kind of a problem. At the same point of time, in some other unorganized sector, plantation workers or anyone else, household the workers, they would be having different other kind of problems. So when you look holistically, would there be a possibility of bringing some commonalities between these unorganized sectors and then complete your thesis out of that? If you find that, yes, you can take all unorganized sector and you can do a wonderful thesis within 200 pages. But on the contrary, you find that the BD workers' problems are entirely different, household workers' problems are entirely different, and plantation workers are entirely different. Then for every single thing, you have to develop a chapter, which might be unfeasible. Ultimately, you might have to have 25 different chapters on different unorganized sector workers. So that is why I think in terms of that, and I'm not an expert to say on it. I'm not a labor law expert or maybe not the sector laws expert actually. So I can't tell that, but it is left to you as a researcher to find out what is feasible within the time limit as well as within actually the word limit or maybe page limits, whatever you want to have.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Dr. Dinesh may unmute and ask.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, am I audible?
Yes,
Thank you, sir, for so nice lectures you have delivered. Sir, I have two questions. First, what is the difference in between research questions and hypothesis, and whether hypothesis can be mentioned in the doctrinal research or only can be only in a non-doctrinal? Please clarify about it.
Yeah, let me just unmute. Yes. All right. So research questions and hypotheses. See, if I have to answer it simply, hypothesis is a kind of an answer which you have to the research question in the beginning. It's an answer, right? So you might have a research question as to actually say how far the Indian laws are effective in terms of tackling with the medical negligence in India. Your hypothesis might be that actually given the current scenario wherein more and more cases are coming up and the consumer courts are having a lot of pending cases, existing norms are not adequate. That would be your hypothesis. Right? It's an answer to your research question, but you can't stick to this answer because you have not done your research completely. You have just actually done the preliminary research. On the basis of that, you have an assumption or proposition on the research question. Right? That's the first thing. Second thing, hypothesis, whether it is actually only confined to non-doctrinal or the empirical research, you basically asked. No, it can also be in the case of a doctrinal research. Right? It can be in both actually. Say even in say cases like say, for example, you are trying to actually analyze, maybe you are doing some kind of an historical research, right? Some historical research wherein you are trying to speak about say Maratha rules or maybe something like that, some legislative reforms during the Marathas, something like that historical research you would be. You might be going for only doctrinal study, you don't have any empirical component in that. Despite that, you might have a kind of an hypothesis that the Maratha kings were very sympathetic towards actually all religions. Such kind of a hypothesis you might have. Right? So it is not that hypothesis is only in case of empirical research. It can also be there in the doctrinal research.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks, sir.
Okay. Any more questions? I hope no. Okay, thank you all. Now we are winding up this Q&A session. And now I welcome Ms. Amrita, student of First MLLM, Kerala Law Academy Law College, to give the word of thanks.
Good afternoon all. I, Amrita Susan Jacob, on behalf of Kerala Law Academy Law College, consider this as a privilege to propose the vote of thanks. First and foremost, on behalf of our college, I thank our special guest, Dr. Sandeepa Bhat, Professor of Law and Director of Center for Aviation and Space Law, NUJS Calcutta, who despite his busy schedule has found time to grace the occasion. It was indeed a great opportunity to hear you Your thoughts, sir. Next, I thank Advocate Nagaraj Narayan, Director of Kerala Law Academy Law College, for standing as a pillar of strength of this institution and supporting us throughout this workshop. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our principal, Professor Harindran sir, for his constant support. An event cannot become a success without the proper guidance of the faculty members. I would like to thank Professor Anil Kumar K, Professor G. Anil Kumar, Professor Ajita Nair, Assistant Professor Dakshina Saraswati, and all other faculty members behind this workshop for their huge support and encouragement. No event can happen without the provision of a vast network of people. I hereby thank the entire technical team for their support, without which this event would not become a success. Last but not least, I thank all the participants of this workshop for their time and cooperation in making this event a success. Thank you all.
Thank you, Amrita. With this, we conclude our third session of the 16th two-day National Workshop on Research Methodology. I extend my thanks to all those who made this discussion a fruitful one with your valuable contributions. I humbly request everyone to attend the fourth session of the workshop scheduled at 4 p.m. Thank you, everyone. This is K. Kavya Mohan signing off. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks.